Welcome to Earth Systems. Mineral resources and geology is what we'll talk about first, and then we'll go into weathering and soil science.